To speak to what John was saying about metagaming, how many your characters experience something kind of one-on-one with the DM and have the other players forget that they are not there. Their characters are not watching this happen. It's a one-on-one thing. It's what the whisper function is for on Roll20, really. Because then the other characters just don't know, and you don't have to worry about it. But in terms of metagaming, there's something that a lot of groups do, which is you just hand wave it by saying, my character exposits what the DM just said, because it'd be too long to just go and roleplay it out and describe it again, because we already described it once and everybody heard it. So I don't think there's too much wrong with metagaming in the sense of trying to create a better narrative, like John says. I think the only thing that I have a problem with when it comes to metagaming is stuff like looking up monster stats for the encounter you're in. Like, don't do that. That's kind of lame. Or looking up the module, even worse. There was a community episode, which is banned, by the way, that the gang is like playing D&D with each other. I won't say why it's banned, but the gang is playing D&D with each other, and Pierce, the old man, is excluded from the group in this sense, and then comes in later and happens to have access to the module that they're playing. And he's like, I want to be part of this. And, of course, that leads to some dark shenanigans. It's quite interesting because that's hardcore metagaming. That's like metagaming that ruins the game. I think that might be the defining line, actually, is when metagaming starts to make things bad in the game, make things worse, ruin the experience, ruin the immersion for players. That's when metagaming becomes a problem, because you're just basically just ruining the suspension of disbelief for everyone else when you do the kind of metagaming I'm talking about. But when you do metagaming in a way that is conducive to the narrative and makes things easier to understand and immerse ourselves in, that's when it's like, yeah, that's fine, like whatever. Like hitting a monster's AC, for example. AC is not a thing in the world. It's a gameplay mechanic, but after a while in combat, you're gonna hit that AC, and is it metagaming then to say, or to have a character know what they need to hit it now? Maybe if they've exposed a weakness narratively. Is it metagaming to have players tell each other what the AC is? It's like, oh, okay, now I know what I need to hit. No, it just takes a load off people's shoulders. And I think that's fine.
I think that there's also not a middle ground, like not a compromise, but there's a win-win here, which is, so for those of you who haven't checked it out yet, we now have a website, dmshowerthoughts.com, which can post all sorts of blog posts, and all of our podcast episodes are up on it, as well as the thing I'm going to talk about, which is the recap fiction. So, which is, a lot of times in my, we've talked about this a little bit, in my latest campaign world, because I have my players record their gameplay decisions with a chat, basically we get to play the game twice. We get to play the game once in its spontaneous creation using game rules and using metagame thinking, not, again, as a positive thing, not as something that's going to undercut the narrative experience, but basically once we've had the fun of spontaneously creating something together, I go back and I retell it as a short story. And the reason I call it a retelling is there might be lines that I edit that like a player said but they didn't really want to say after the fact. There might be things I retcon, things I edit to make a functional story. And really the fun part of that is now the players can go back and see how their decisions, what decisions ended up making it in the final cut, what decisions, mostly for the players, got thankfully removed because it might have been inappropriate or they misheard something or misinterpreted something. And the players get to really relive their adventure without any of the game structure. It's purely narrative on the second way through, And now they all are able to take on the accountability for themselves of immersing themselves in the game world. So they don't need to experience the slice of life stuff because they've experienced the canon again, you know? And because of that, like, that's why I think that the metagame conversation is interesting. How much do we value gameplay, as in the spontaneous act of playing out the game, versus how much we respect the narrative, which is what we agree on is the official story that we're telling. And this was kind of an additive practice, but it's a really good example of one way that you could do it.
And whereas this group started a campaign, the previous campaign, in person, and that has a certain flow to it. And then we changed to online, and that had its own bumps. And now we are restarting with the framework of a structured space where we didn't like just have a brunch and build. We had a month or two of feeding information to each other, of checking on things, of asking questions, of having a whole bunch of interplay there to establish this space. And even in so doing that, the spontaneous role play is extremely energizing with this group in particular. And they want to act. There's a physical acting that comes from it. Which is why I got into the habit of recording them, of like just putting on a microphone in the background so that they can feel free to act. And that has value, great, tremendous value to them. And then, but I didn't want to forget that story. So that's where my tradition of sifting through hours of audio and then trying to transcribe that story, because we found that spontaneous story so valuable. And now the struggle, I can already feel it, is I find that story extremely energizing with this group of people. There's a good energy there that connects differently. It hits different than other tables. In many other tables, there's a uniqueness, like capturing lightning in a bottle, to this particular group. What can also be a challenge there, and I want to frame it as a challenge, is remembering what was said, remembering what was done, and putting it into the framework of is it enough to enjoy the experience in the spontaneity of it, and then when we revisit it, like in a recap sort of scenario, that it is more generalized. Is that all right? Does the specificity of what we said in the moment have to be preserved if we just wanted to act it out? And in acting it out in that spontaneity, in that moment, was fulfilling enough? Do we have to transcribe it later to relive it? And there's a part of me that says yes, because I found great value and I'd love to revisit it. And there's another part of me that says that's really hard to do, given the current framework. Unless I record it and then sift through the audio, which we've already discussed on this podcast, is exhausting. Rewarding too, because I get to kind of relive it, but also exhausting. And maybe the context isn't writing. Maybe it is. I give the recordings to the players so they can re-listen to it in the background, kind of like a podcast, and they can hear what transpired anyway. It's just how would I then deliver. If we really love that spontaneous role play, how do I then re-deliver that experience? Because I want them to relive it. I want them to kind of build that momentum again before we play again. And that's really, really fun. That we've done that before in the past, and it's been highly effective in getting us to re-immerse. My challenge now, because it was so enjoyable last night, I had to vigorously write down everything that we did. I don't know if in a month the players are going to remember all the momentum they had built up, and how do we revisit that in a clean, efficient way that is also enjoyable and energizing.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon, and please Game responsibly.